Maria Santos stood barely 5 feet tall in her combat boots, her small frame dwarfed by the towering men around her at the police academy graduation ceremony. The other cadets exchanged doubtful glances as she stepped forward to receive her badge. At 24, she had fought every step of the way to reach this moment, but the whispers followed her everywhere she went. "She's too small for real police work," muttered Officer Bradley, a veteran with 20 years on the force. "What's she going to do when she faces a real criminal? Ask them nicely to surrender?" The other officers chuckled, but Maria kept her eyes focused straight ahead. She had heard these comments countless times during her training, and each one only strengthened her resolve. Growing up in the rough neighborhoods of East Los Angeles, Maria had witnessed violence and crime firsthand. Her younger brother had been caught in gang crossfire when she was 17, leaving him paralyzed from the waist down. That night in the hospital, watching her family fall apart, she made a promise that would shape the rest of her life. She would dedicate herself to protecting others who couldn't protect themselves. The police academy instructors had initially been skeptical too. During physical training, Maria struggled with some of the strength-based exercises that came easily to her male counterparts. She couldn't match their upper body strength or their long strides during distance runs. However, what she lacked in physical size, she made up for with intelligence, determination, and an uncanny ability to read people and situations. Her marksmanship scores were consistently in the top 5% of her class. While others relied on brute force during tactical training, Maria developed creative problem-solving approaches that often proved more effective. She studied psychology in her spare time, learning about criminal behavior patterns and negotiation techniques. Her instructors began to notice that she had natural instincts for de-escalation and could calm tense situations with her words when others reached for their weapons. Despite her academic excellence and tactical skills, the doubts persisted. Captain Rodriguez, who would become her commanding officer, reviewed her file with concern. "She's got the highest test scores I've seen in years," he told his lieutenant, "but I worry about putting her in dangerous situations. The other officers might spend more time protecting her than focusing on their own safety." Maria's first assignment was to a relatively quiet precinct in the suburbs, handling minor disputes and traffic violations. Her fellow officers treated her like a mascot, keeping her away from anything they considered real police work. When domestic violence calls came in, they would send her to take statements from witnesses while the male officers handled the confrontation. During drug busts, she was assigned to crowd control rather than entry team duties. The frustration was eating away at her confidence. She had joined the force to make a real difference, but instead found herself writing parking tickets and filing paperwork. Her family began to suggest that maybe the other officers were right, that police work wasn't suitable for someone of her size. Even her brother, the one who had inspired her career choice, gently suggested she might consider becoming a teacher or social worker instead. But Maria refused to give up. She volunteered for every training opportunity, attended specialized courses on her own time, and studied case files late into the night. She learned about hostage negotiation techniques, studied famous rescue operations, and practiced tactical scenarios in her mind. Her apartment became filled with criminology textbooks and tactical manuals. 6 months into her career, Maria was still waiting for her chance to prove herself. She watched from the sidelines as her male colleagues handled the challenging cases, gaining experience and recognition, while she remained relegated to routine duties. The department's annual performance reviews were approaching, and she knew that without significant field experience, her career prospects looked dim. Her breakthrough moment came unexpectedly on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. Maria was finishing her shift, completing paperwork at her desk, when the emergency dispatch crackled to life. A bank robbery was in progress downtown, and the situation had escalated into a hostage crisis. All available officers were being called to respond immediately. As Maria grabbed her gear and rushed toward her patrol car, Officer Bradley blocked her path. "Where do you think you're going, Santos? This is serious business, not a training exercise." But Maria had already made up her mind. She had trained for moments like this her entire career, and she wasn't going to let anyone's preconceptions hold her back any longer. "I'm a police officer, just like you," she replied firmly, pushing past him toward her vehicle. "Those people in there need every trained officer available regardless of size." As she drove toward the scene, Her heart pounded with a mixture of fear and excitement. This was her moment to prove that being underestimated could actually be an advantage. The city streets blurred past her window as she raced toward what would become the defining moment of her career. She had no idea that by the end of the day, she would be responsible for saving 50 innocent lives and completely changing how her department viewed female officers. All she knew was that people were in danger, and she had the skills and determination to help them, no matter what anyone else believed about her capabilities. The scene that greeted Maria at First National Bank was chaos. Police cars surrounded the building, their red and blue lights painting the afternoon sky in urgent colors. SWAT vehicles had already arrived, and officers were establishing a perimeter behind concrete barriers and parked cars. The usually busy downtown street had been completely evacuated, leaving only law enforcement personnel and emergency vehicles. Maria parked her patrol car 2 blocks away and approached the command post, a mobile unit that had been set up across from the bank's main entrance. Inside, she could see Captain Rodriguez speaking rapidly into his radio while studying building blueprints spread across a folding table. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. "What's the situation?" Maria asked Sergeant Williams, who was coordinating the outer perimeter. He glanced at her with surprise, as if he hadn't expected to see her at such a serious scene. 3 armed suspects entered the bank around 2:30, Williams explained, his voice grim. They planned to rob the place, but something went wrong. A silent alarm was triggered early and patrol units arrived before they could escape. Now they're barricaded inside with approximately 50 hostages, including customers and bank employees. Maria felt her stomach tighten as she processed the information. 50 innocent people trapped inside with desperate criminals was a nightmare scenario. She watched as more specialized units arrived. The bomb squad, hostage negotiators, and additional SWAT team members. The parking lot was beginning to look like a small military operation. Through her binoculars, Maria could see movement in the bank's windows. The suspects had covered most of the glass with papers and posters, but occasionally she caught glimpses of people moving inside. Her training kicked in as she began to mentally map the building's layout, remembering the times she had visited this particular branch to deposit her paychecks. The bank was a traditional 2-story building with the main customer area on the ground, floor and administrative offices upstairs. There were 3 main entrances: the front door facing the street, a side entrance used by employees, and a rear exit that led to the parking lot. The vault was located in the basement, accessible through a stairway behind the teller counter. Captain Rodriguez emerged from the command post, his face etched with worry. "The suspects are demanding a helicopter and safe passage out of the city," he announced to the assembled officers. "They've threatened to start killing hostages if we don't comply within 4 hours. We need to establish communication and assess their mental state." The department's lead hostage negotiator, Detective Sarah Chen, had already set up her equipment and was attempting to make contact with the suspects through the bank's phone system. So far, they weren't answering any calls, which made the situation even more dangerous. Without communication, it was impossible to gauge their intentions or level of desperation. Maria watched as the SWAT team leader, Commander Hayes, briefed his unit on potential entry points. The bank's design made it particularly challenging for a tactical assault. The main entrance was completely exposed to the street, offering no cover for approaching officers. The side and rear entrances were likely being monitored by the suspects, and any attempt to breach them would probably result in hostage casualties. "We need eyes inside," Commander Hayes said, pointing to the building schematic. Without knowing the exact positions of the hostages and suspects, any rescue attempt is suicide. The team began discussing options for surveillance, including the possibility of using fiber optic cameras to see inside the building. As the afternoon stretched on, the situation grew increasingly tense. Local news crews had arrived and were broadcasting live from the scene, adding pressure from city officials and the public. Maria could see worried family members gathering behind the police barriers, desperately seeking information about their loved ones trapped inside. She overheard one woman crying as she spoke to a police officer. "My daughter works as a teller there," the woman sobbed. "She just started the job last month. Please tell me she's okay." The officer could only offer vague reassurances, but Maria could see the pain in his eyes. Without communication from inside, they had no way of knowing who was hurt or how the hostages were being treated. Detective Chen finally managed to establish brief contact with one of the suspects around 4 o'clock. The conversation lasted only 3 minutes before the suspect hung up, but it provided valuable intelligence. There were indeed 3 armed men, and they appeared to be increasingly agitated as their escape plans fell apart. "They're not professional criminals," Chen reported to Captain Rodriguez. "This feels like a desperate robbery gone wrong, not a planned terrorist attack. That makes them more unpredictable but also potentially more willing to negotiate." However, the suspects had made it clear that they would start executing hostages if their demands weren't met by 6 o'clock. Maria found herself studying the building more intently, looking for details that others might have missed. Her small stature had always forced her to think creatively about approaching problems, and she began to see possibilities that the larger SWAT officers couldn't consider. She noticed that the bank's architecture included decorative elements that could provide unexpected access points. There were ornamental ledges running along the building's exterior, and the second-floor windows were slightly different from the ground-floor ones. Some appeared to be older casement windows that might open, rather than the newer fixed panes. More importantly, Maria remembered something from her visits to the bank that wasn't shown on the official blueprints. During construction renovations 2 years earlier, she had noticed temporary scaffolding in work areas that suggested additional service entrances or maintenance access points. These might not be monitored by the suspects, who would logically focus on the main entrances. As the deadline approached and tension mounted, Maria realized that her unique perspective and willingness to take risks might be exactly what the situation required. The conventional approach of waiting for negotiation or planning a large-scale, tactical assault might not work in time to save the hostages. She began to formulate a plan that would use her size and agility as advantages rather than limitations. If she could find a way to get inside undetected, she might be able to provide the intelligence and support that the rescue operation desperately needed. The question was whether anyone would listen to the officer they had dismissed as too small for serious police work. Time was running out, and Maria could feel the weight of 50 lives pressing down on everyone at the scene. The digital clock on the command post showed 5:15 p.m., leaving only 45 minutes until the suspect's deadline. Despite hours of attempted negotiation, Detective Chen had only managed to establish sporadic contact with the bank robbers, and their demands remained unchanged. A helicopter and safe passage, or they would start killing hostages. Maria approached Captain Rodriguez as he huddled with Commander Hayes and the other senior officers. Their faces were etched with the kind of desperation that comes when all conventional options have been exhausted. The SWAT team had identified potential breach points, but every scenario they ran ended with unacceptable casualty projections. "Captain," Maria said, her voice steady despite her racing heart, "I have an idea that might work." Rodriguez looked up from the building plans with barely concealed frustration. The last thing he needed was input from his least experienced officer. "Santos, this isn't the time for suggestions," he replied curtly. "We have specialists handling this situation." But Maria didn't back down. She had been studying the building for hours, and she was convinced she had spotted something everyone else had missed. "Sir, with respect, those specialists don't know this building like I do," she persisted. "I've been inside that bank dozens of times, and I noticed something during the renovations last year that isn't on any of these blueprints." She pointed to the architectural drawings spread across the table. "Commander." Hayes looked up with interest despite himself. "What kind of something?" he asked, his tone skeptical but curious. Maria pulled out her notebook, where she had been sketching her observations throughout the afternoon. "There's a service tunnel that connects to the building's old heating system," Maria explained, drawing a rough diagram. "It was installed in the 1950s when the bank was first built, but it was sealed off during the renovations. However, I saw workers using it to run new electrical cables. The entrance is in the basement of the building next door, which is currently vacant." Captain Rodriguez studied her sketch with growing interest. The tunnel would potentially allow access to the bank's basement level, below where the hostages were being held. More importantly, it would be completely unknown to the suspects, who had only been in the building for a few hours. "Even if this tunnel exists," Commander Hayes said, "it would be too narrow for our tactical team. We're talking about a service passage designed for maintenance workers, not armed officers in full gear." Maria had anticipated this objection, and it was exactly why she believed she was the right person for this mission. "That's where my size becomes an advantage instead of a limitation," she said firmly. "I can fit through spaces that would be impossible for larger officers. Once I'm inside, I can unlock the rear entrance for the SWAT team and provide intelligence on the suspects' positions." The command post fell silent as the senior officers considered her proposal. Detective Chen, who had been listening to the conversation, spoke up from her communication station. "The suspects just made another call," she announced grimly. "They're getting more agitated. One of them threatened to shoot a hostage in 20 minutes if they don't see a helicopter landing in the parking lot." The pressure of the ticking clock made Maria's plan suddenly seem less crazy and more necessary. Captain Rodriguez looked at the building schematics one more time, then turned to Commander Hayes. "Can you get into that adjacent building and verify this tunnel?" he asked. Within 10 minutes, a small team had entered the vacant office building next to the bank. Using Maria's directions, they located the basement access panel she had described. Behind it was indeed a narrow service tunnel, approximately 3 feet in diameter, that appeared to run directly toward the bank building. "It's tight, but it's there," reported Officer Johnson via radio. "The tunnel is in decent condition and we can see light at the far end, which probably means it connects to the bank's basement. But I have to agree with Santos. Only someone very small could make it through this space." Maria felt a mixture of vindication and terror as she realized her plan was actually feasible. Captain Rodriguez pulled her aside for a private conversation away from the other officers. His expression was serious and she could see the weight of command in his eyes. "Santos, I need you to understand what you're volunteering for," he said quietly. "This isn't a training exercise or a routine call. If something goes wrong in that tunnel, we might not be able to get you out, and once you're inside the bank, you'll be completely on your own until we can execute the rescue." Maria nodded, her resolve unwavering despite the fear churning in her stomach. "Captain, I became a police officer to protect people who can't protect themselves. Right now, 50 innocent people are counting on us to save them. If my size and knowledge of this building can make the difference, then I have to try." The captain studied her face for a long moment, then made his decision. "Okay, but we do this by the book. You go in light, service weapon, radio, and basic gear only. Your mission is intelligence gathering and unlocking that rear entrance. No heroics, no attempting to engage the suspects on your own. Is that understood?" "Understood, sir," Maria replied. Though they both knew that once she was inside the bank, she would have to make split-second decisions based on whatever she encountered. Plans had a way of changing when lives were on the line. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the street, Maria prepared for what could be the most important mission of her career. The other officers watched with a mixture of admiration and concern as she stripped down to essential equipment. Some of the same people who had questioned her capabilities were now depending on her to save the day. Detective Chen approached as Maria was checking her radio equipment. "I've been monitoring police frequencies," she said. "The suspects have a radio scanner, so we can't use normal channels once you're inside. Switch to channel 7. It's encrypted and they won't be able to intercept our communications." Maria clipped the radio to her belt and took a deep breath. In 15 minutes, she would enter that tunnel and begin a journey that would either save 50 lives or end her own. The weight of responsibility was enormous, but for the first time in her career, she felt like she was exactly where she belonged. The service tunnel was even more claustrophobic than Maria had expected. Crawling on her hands and knees through the narrow passage, she could barely see her hands in front of her face. The small flashlight clipped to her collar provided just enough illumination to avoid the occasional pipe or electrical conduit that jutted into her path. Every few feet she had to pause and listen for sounds from above, trying to gauge her position relative to the bank's layout. The tunnel smelled of decades-old dust and metal, with an underlying dampness that suggested poor ventilation. Maria's uniform was already filthy and she could feel cobwebs clinging to her hair and equipment. But physical discomfort was the least of her concerns as she slowly made her way toward what she hoped would be access to the bank's basement. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, Maria saw a dim light ahead. The tunnel ended at what appeared to be another access panel, similar to the one she had entered through. She could hear muffled sounds from above, voices, footsteps, and what might have been crying or sobbing. The reality of 50 terrified hostages hit her with renewed force. Maria carefully examined the panel, looking for a way to open it without making noise. The metal was corroded with age, and she worried that forcing it might create a sound that would alert the suspects to her presence. Using her multi-tool, she slowly worked at the screws holding the panel in place, stopping frequently to listen for any indication that she had been detected. When the panel finally came free, Maria found herself looking into the bank's basement storage area. Dim emergency lighting provided just enough visibility for her to see stacks of boxes, old furniture, and filing cabinets. More importantly, she could hear voices more clearly now, filtering down from the main floor above her head. She activated her encrypted radio and whispered as quietly as possible. "Command, this is Santos. I'm in the basement. I can hear voices upstairs, but I need to get closer to assess the situation." Captain Rodriguez's voice crackled back through her earpiece, barely audible to avoid detection. "Copy that, Santos. What's your status?" Maria looked around the basement, trying to orient herself with the building's layout that she had memorized earlier. The stairs leading to the main floor were about 30 feet away, but she would have to cross an open area to reach them. "I'm going to move to the stairway and try to get a visual on the main floor," she whispered back. "The rear exit should be accessible from there." As she prepared to leave the relative safety of the storage area, Maria heard a sound that made her blood run cold. A man's voice shouting angrily, followed by what sounded like someone being struck. Moving as quietly as possible, Maria crept across the basement toward the stairway. Each step seemed impossibly loud in the silence, and she was certain that her heartbeat could be heard throughout the building. When she reached the stairs, she could finally make out distinct voices from the main floor. "I'm telling you, they're not going to give us a helicopter," one man was saying, his voice high with panic. "We should have left when we had the chance. Now we're trapped in here with all these people." "Shut up, Marcus," another voice snapped. "We stick to the plan. If they don't give us what we want, we start shooting people. That'll get their attention." Maria realized with growing horror that the suspects were becoming more desperate and unpredictable as their situation deteriorated. She carefully climbed the stairs, pausing at each step to listen and assess the situation above. Near the top, she found a position where she could see through a crack in the door that led to the main banking floor. What she saw made her stomach clench with fear and determination. The hostages were grouped in the center of the floor, sitting on the ground with their hands visible. Maria counted approximately 40 people, which meant there were probably more in other areas of the bank. Most looked terrified but unharmed, though she could see that several were clearly injured, likely from the initial confrontation when the robbery began. 3 armed men were pacing around the hostages, each carrying what appeared to be semi-automatic weapons. The one called Marcus looked young, maybe early 20s, and was obviously struggling with the stress of the situation. The second suspect was older and seemed to be the leader, barking orders and checking his watch constantly. The third man was positioned near the front windows, keeping watch on the street outside. Maria observed their positions and patterns of movement, noting that they were focused primarily on the main entrances and windows. None of them seemed to be paying attention to the rear of the building or the stairway where she was hiding. This oversight might be the key to getting the SWAT team inside. She whispered into her radio, providing a detailed report of what she was seeing. "Command, I have eyes on 3 suspects and approximately 40 hostages on the main floor. Suspects are armed with automatic weapons and appear increasingly agitated. I need to locate the remaining hostages and find a way to unlock the rear entrance." Captain Rodriguez's voice came back immediately. "Santos, we're showing 5:52 p.m. You need to move fast. They're threatening to execute someone in 8 minutes. Can you reach the rear exit?" Maria studied the layout of the main floor, looking for a path that would keep her hidden from the suspects. The rear exit was about 50 feet away, but she would have to cross behind the teller counter and through a small hallway that led to the employee areas. If any of the suspects turned around at the wrong moment, she would be completely exposed. But as she watched the 3 men continue their agitated pacing, Maria realized that their attention was entirely focused on the front of the building and the hostages. They were watching for police activity from the street, not expecting any threat to come from inside the building. Their oversight was about to become their fatal mistake. Taking a deep breath, Maria opened the door and stepped onto the main floor of the bank. For the first time in her law enforcement career, she was truly in the line of fire, with nothing between her and armed criminals except her training, her courage, and the element of surprise. 50 lives depended on what she did in the next few minutes, and failure wasn't an option. She moved along the wall, staying low and keeping to the shadows as she made her way toward the rear of the building. Each step brought her closer to either success or disaster, and she could feel the weight of every decision as she prepared to unlock the door that would bring salvation or chaos to everyone trapped inside the First National Bank. Maria pressed herself against the wall behind the teller counter, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain the suspects would hear it. From her new position, she had a clearer view of the entire situation, and what she saw made her realize the crisis was even worse than anyone had imagined. In addition to the 40 hostages she had counted on the main floor, she could now see that several bank employees were being held in a separate group near the vault entrance. Among them was the bank manager, whose name tag identified her as Janet Morrison. The woman appeared to be injured, with blood visible on her white blouse, and she was clearly struggling to stay conscious. The suspect leader, a heavy-set man with a distinctive scar across his cheek, was becoming increasingly erratic. He kept checking his watch and muttering to himself, while waving his weapon dangerously close to the hostages. Maria realized that he was probably under the influence of drugs or alcohol, which made him even more unpredictable and dangerous. 6 minutes, the leader suddenly shouted, his voice echoing through the bank. 6 minutes and then people start dying. I want to see that helicopter on the ground or this lady gets a bullet. He pointed his weapon directly at Janet Morrison, who closed her eyes and began to pray silently. Maria knew she was out of time. The SWAT team needed that rear entrance open immediately, and there was no way to do it without taking enormous risks. She studied the path she would need to take, noting that she would have to cross an open area where any of the 3 suspects might see her if they turned around. She whispered into her radio one final time before making her move. Command, I'm at the rear of the building. The suspects are about to execute the bank manager. I'm opening the rear entrance now, whether I'm detected or not. Be ready to breach immediately. Captain Rodriguez's voice came back with barely controlled urgency. Santos, the SWAT team is in position. Once you open that door, we're coming in hard and fast. Keep your head down and stay out of the line of fire. Maria took a deep breath and began her sprint toward the rear exit. She stayed as low as possible, using desks and furniture for cover, but she was completely exposed for several steps in the middle of the corridor. Time seemed to slow as she ran, expecting at any moment to hear shouts of discovery or the sound of gunfire. She reached the rear exit without being detected and immediately began working on the locks. The door had multiple security mechanisms, a deadbolt, a chain lock, and an electronic security system that needed to be disarmed. Her hands shook as she worked, knowing that every second that passed brought the hostages closer to execution. The deadbolt opened easily, but the chain lock was rusted and difficult to manipulate. Maria could hear the leader's voice growing more agitated as he continued his countdown. 4 minutes. Where's my helicopter? I'm not playing games here. Finally, the chain came free, and Maria reached for the electronic panel. This was the most dangerous part. Disarming the security system would trigger a brief alarm chirp that might alert the suspects. She had to time it perfectly with some other sound that would mask the noise. As if answering her prayers, one of the hostages began sobbing loudly, a sound that provided just enough cover for Maria to disarm the system. The rear door was now unlocked and ready for the SWAT team's entry. She pressed herself against the wall beside the door and whispered into her radio. Rear entrance is open. Repeat, rear entrance is open. I'm taking cover. Outside, she could hear the almost silent footsteps of the tactical team moving into position. Commander Hayes and his officers had rehearsed this type of operation hundreds of times, and they would execute it with precision and speed. But as Maria waited for the breach to begin, she heard something that changed everything. The suspect, called Marcus, the youngest of the 3, was having what appeared to be a complete breakdown. He was pointing his weapon erratically and screaming at the hostages. "This is insane," Marcus shouted. "I never signed up for this. I'm not going to prison for the rest of my life." The bank manager, Janet Morrison, was trying to calm him down, speaking in quiet, soothing tones despite her own injuries and terror. "It's okay," Janet was saying softly. "Nobody has to get hurt here. The police just want everyone to be safe. We can work this out." But Marcus was beyond reasoning. and his finger was tightening on the trigger of his weapon. Maria realized with horror that the SWAT team breach was still 30 seconds away, and Marcus was about to start shooting hostages in a panic-driven rampage. Without thinking, she made a decision that would either save lives or end her own career and possibly her life. She stepped out from behind cover and called out to Marcus in the calmest voice she could manage. "Marcus, look at me. My name is Maria, and I'm here to help you." The young man spun around, his weapon now pointed directly at her, but she didn't stop talking. "I know you're scared," she continued, slowly raising her hands to show she wasn't armed. "I know this isn't what you planned. But right now you have a choice. You can be the person who hurt innocent people, or you can be the person who helped save them." The other two suspects had also turned toward her now, their weapons trained on her small figure. The leader with the scar was shouting questions. Who was she? How did she get inside? Where were the other police? But Maria kept her focus on Marcus, reading the conflict and fear in his young face. "Marcus, look around you," she said gently, gesturing toward the terrified hostages. "These are somebody's mothers and fathers, somebody's children. They're just here trying to do their banking, and now they're terrified. You have the power to end their fear right now." For a moment that seemed to stretch forever, the bank was completely silent except for the quiet sobbing of the hostages. Maria could see Marcus wavering, his weapon shaking in his hands as he struggled with the decision that would define the rest of his life. Behind him, she could see the SWAT team moving into position for their final approach. In 10 seconds, the rescue operation would begin, and the outcome would depend entirely on the choices made by a young criminal and a small police officer, who had refused to accept that she was too little to make a big difference. The silence in the bank stretched like a taut wire, with 50 lives hanging in the balance. Marcus stood frozen, his weapon pointed at Maria, while tears streamed down his young face. The internal battle raging in his mind was visible to everyone in the room, and Maria knew that her next words could determine whether this ended in tragedy or triumph. "Marcus, I can see you're a good person who made some bad choices," she said softly, taking a small step forward despite the weapons trained on her. "But right now, in this moment, you can choose to be a hero instead of a villain. You can choose to protect these people instead of hurting them." The leader with the scar was screaming at Marcus to shoot her, but something in Maria's calm voice seemed to cut through the chaos and reach the frightened young man. His hands were shaking so violently that he could barely hold his weapon steady, and Maria could see the exact moment when his resolve finally cracked. "I don't want to hurt anybody," Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible above the sobs of the hostages. "I just needed money for my mom's medical bills. She's dying and I couldn't watch her suffer anymore." The raw pain in his confession touched something in Maria's heart, even as she remained focused on the tactical situation. "I understand," Maria replied, her voice filled with genuine compassion. "My brother was hurt when I was younger, and my family struggled with medical bills too. But this isn't the way to help your mother. Let me help you find a better way." Behind the suspects, Maria could see the shadows of the SWAT team moving into final position. Commander Hayes had his hand raised, ready to give the signal for the coordinated breach. In seconds, flashbang grenades would explode and tactical officers would flood the building from multiple entry points. But Maria realized that a violent rescue operation might result in casualties among the hostages, especially with 3 armed and desperate suspects. If she could convince just one of them to surrender, it might create enough confusion and doubt to save lives when the assault began. "Marcus, I want you to look at these people around you," Maria said, gesturing toward the hostages who were watching the confrontation with terrified fascination. "That woman there," she pointed to an elderly lady clutching her purse. "She reminds me of my grandmother. That man over there probably has children waiting for him to come home from work." The young suspect's weapon was gradually lowering as Maria's words penetrated his panic and desperation. She could see that he was fighting against everything his partners had told him, struggling to remember the person he had been before desperation drove him to crime. "These people aren't your enemies, Marcus. They're just regular folks trying to live their lives. And right now, you have the chance to be the person who saved them instead of the person who hurt them. Your mother wouldn't want you to become a killer to pay for her medical bills." The scarred leader had had enough of Marcus's wavering and moved to take control of the situation himself. "If you won't shoot the cop, I will," he snarled, turning his weapon toward Maria with deadly intent. But Marcus surprised everyone, including himself, by stepping between his partner and Maria. "No, Tony." "She's right. This has gone too far. I won't let you hurt her or anyone else." The young man's transformation from terrified criminal to protective ally happened in an instant, fueled by Maria's appeal to his humanity. The third suspect, who had been silent throughout the confrontation, suddenly threw down his weapon and raised his hands. "I'm done with this," he announced. "I surrender. I'm not dying for a bank robbery that was doomed from the start." His surrender created exactly the confusion Maria had hoped for. Tony, the scarred leader, found himself outnumbered and surrounded by doubt. His own partners had abandoned him, and he was facing a police officer who seemed utterly unafraid despite being outgunned. For the first time since the robbery began, uncertainty crept into his voice. "This changes nothing," he shouted, but his bravado was clearly forced. "I still have a gun and I still have hostages. You think one small cop is going to stop me?" But as he spoke, Maria noticed his hand trembling slightly, and she knew his confidence was cracking. At that exact moment, Commander Hayes gave the signal for the SWAT team assault. Flashbang grenades exploded simultaneously at the front and side entrances, filling the bank with blinding light and deafening noise. Tactical officers poured through the breached entrances, their movements coordinated with military precision. But Maria was ready for the assault, and she used the confusion to her advantage. As Tony was temporarily blinded and disoriented by the flashbangs, she lunged forward and knocked his weapon aside. Her small size allowed her to get underneath his guard, and her police academy training took over as she wrestled the gun away from him. Marcus immediately helped her subdue Tony, using his insider knowledge of the leader's aggressive tendencies to anticipate his moves. Within 30 seconds of the breach, all three suspects were on the ground in handcuffs, and the hostages were being evacuated to safety. Maria found herself sitting on the bank floor, her adrenaline finally wearing off as she realized what had just happened. She had entered the building as an underestimated rookie officer, and she was leaving as the hero who had saved 50 innocent lives. But more importantly, she had proven to herself and everyone else that courage and intelligence mattered more than physical size. Captain Rodriguez was the first to reach her, his face showing a mixture of relief, pride, and amazement. "Santos, I don't know whether to promote you or arrest you for disobeying orders," he said with a grin. "You were supposed to unlock the door and provide intelligence, not negotiate with armed suspects." "Sorry, Captain," Maria replied, brushing dust and cobwebs from her uniform. "But it looked like Marcus was about to start shooting and I couldn't just watch innocent people die. Sometimes you have to trust your instincts and do what's right, even if it's not in the manual." The aftermath of the rescue was a whirlwind of activity. Paramedics treated the injured hostages, including bank manager Janet Morrison, who would make a full recovery from her wounds. The three suspects were transported to jail, with Marcus receiving a lighter sentence in exchange for his cooperation and last-minute change of heart. Local and national news crews descended on the scene, eager to tell the story of the small police officer who had crawled through a service tunnel and talked down armed bank robbers. Maria found herself thrust into the spotlight, uncomfortable with the attention but gratified by the recognition of her fellow officers. Officer Bradley, who had questioned her capabilities on her first day, approached her as she was giving her statement to internal affairs investigators. "Santos, I owe you an apology," he said, extending his hand. "I was wrong about you. Size doesn't determine heart, and you've got more heart than any officer I've ever worked with." The department's attitude toward female officers changed dramatically after Maria's heroic actions. She became a role model and mentor for other women entering law enforcement, proving that determination and intelligence could overcome physical limitations. Her success opened doors for others who had been dismissed or underestimated. 6 months later, Maria was promoted to detective and assigned to the hostage negotiation team, where her skills in reading people and de-escalating dangerous situations made her invaluable. The woman who had been considered too small for police work had become one of the department's most effective officers. Marcus kept his promise to change his life. With help from the Victim Services Fund and Maria's personal advocacy, his mother received the medical treatment she needed. He served his sentence and later became a counselor working with at-risk youth, sharing his story as a warning about how desperation can lead to terrible choices. During her commendation ceremony, where Maria received the department's highest honor for valor, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. Every doubt, every dismissive comment, every barrier had only strengthened her resolve to prove that heroes come in all sizes. As she stood at the podium, looking out at an audience that included the 50 hostages whose lives she had saved, Maria spoke from her heart. "I learned that being underestimated can be the greatest advantage of all," she said. "When people don't expect much from you, you have the freedom to exceed every expectation. Sometimes the smallest person in the room has the biggest impact." The standing ovation that followed lasted for 5 minutes, but Maria's legacy would last much longer. She had forever changed how her department, her community, and she herself viewed what it meant to be a police officer. In a career dedicated to protecting others, she had finally proven that courage, intelligence, and determination matter far more than physical stature. From that day forward, whenever young recruits doubted their own capabilities or faced discrimination based on their size, gender, or background, their instructors would tell them the story of Officer Maria Santos, the woman who was dismissed as too small for the fight, but who entered the fire and rescued 50 hostages when it mattered most.